This is Honolulu. Glass, steel, concrete. A symphony of modern capital reaching for the sky. In the center of this landscape, the Hawaii State Capitol. A building resembling a volcano, surrounded by water. A symbol of American power in the very heart of the Pacific. But if you look closely, right at its base, you can notice a note that sounds completely different. Elegant, defiant, almost out of place. Iolani Palace, the only official royal residence in the entire United States. Tourists see it as a Victorian curiosity, a perfect backdrop for photos. But for others, for those whose ancestors knew this land long before flags and constitutions, it is sacred ground. They touch its cast-iron fence not as a museum exhibit, but as a headstone polished to a mirror shine. And herein lies its main, tragic paradox. This palace was built to declare the strength and independence of the Hawaiian nation. But it was erected with the money that destroyed that very nation. Every one of its stones, every Corinthian column, was paid for by the streams of sugar profits that ultimately washed the Hawaiian monarchy from the face of the earth. It was built by a man whose enemies, American planters, contemptuously called a spendthrift madman. January 17th, 1993. Thousands of people gather on the lawns in front of the palace. They are not celebrating. They are in mourning. On the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of their kingdom, they came here, to this building, to mourn what was stolen. On that day, the palace ceased to be just architecture. It became the living heart of pain and pride. It became proof that a memory cannot be overthrown as easily as a government. How did a project, branded by contemporaries as royal folly and considered a reckless attempt to imitate the West, become the main symbol of Hawaiian resistance? How did a building constructed to assert power become a monument to its loss? And why is it the one that today holds the stolen soul of an entire nation? Every kingdom is built on gold. But the gold of the Hawaiian monarchy in the late 19th century was white. It was sweet, and it grew straight from the volcanic soil. It was sugar, a commodity that promised prosperity, but demanded a soul in return. To understand how Iolani Palace was built, you must understand the deal its creator made. The year was 1875. The Hawaiian economy was suffocating. And then King Kalākaua achieved the impossible, the reciprocity treaty with the United States. On paper, it looked like salvation. Hawaiian sugar gained duty-free access to the giant American market. It was like opening the floodgates of a financial dam. A golden rain poured down on the islands. Over 15 years, sugar exports skyrocketed tenfold, from 12,500 tons to more than 125,000 tons per year. The kingdom's treasury, empty just yesterday, began to fill. But America didn't give gifts. It bought footholds. In the treaty, there was a clause, a piece of fine print that changed history. In exchange for the sugar privilege, Hawaii ceded exclusive rights to the United States to use a deep water harbor, a place called Pearl Harbor. The money flowed like a river, but whose pockets was it filling? Not the Hawaiians. The main beneficiaries of this boom were a group of American and European businessmen known as the Big Five. They were the descendants of Protestant missionaries. Their fathers had come to the islands to save souls, quote the Bible, and teach literacy. Their children and grandchildren stayed to take the land. Their wealth grew from a tragedy that occurred a generation earlier, from the Great Mahele of 1848. This was a land reform imposed by Western advisors that destroyed a 1,000-year-old system of communal ownership. It introduced the foreign concept of private property. For a Hawaiian, The land was an ancestor, a part of oneself. For a foreigner, it was an asset to be bought and sold. Lacking an understanding of the new laws, thousands of native inhabitants lost their plots of land, which were bought up for next to nothing. It was on this very land, taken from the people, that the plantations of the Big Five grew. The price of Iolani Palace is not just the dollars in the treasury. It's the acres of land torn from the hands of the native people. It's the cubic meters of fresh water diverted from the taro fields to the plantations. It is sovereignty itself, slowly but surely, ceded to the sugar barons. The money was on the table, huge, dangerous, and steeped in foreign interests. But to turn this wealth into a symbol of the nation, a man was needed. A monarch with a dream as grand as it was reckless, and he was already waiting for his moment. He appears on the stage, King David Kalākaua. He was not an heir by birthright. He was elected, which means that from the first day of his reign, he knew how fragile power could be. He was a Renaissance man, caught between ancient Polynesian chants and the Edison phonograph he so adored. And he was the first monarch in history to circumnavigate the globe. This journey was a revelation for him. In the palaces of Europe, he saw not just luxury, he saw a language with which the great powers spoke to each other and to the world, a language of stone, marble, and gilt. Every portico, every colonnade, every throne room was not an adornment, but an assertion. They declared eternity, the right to rule, and permanence. Returning home to his islands, he looked at the modest wooden residence of the Hawaiian kings with fresh, frightened eyes. In the eyes of the West, this was not a palace. It was a temporary structure, a symbol of something transient, something that could be easily wiped off the map. His motivation was not vanity. It was fear and a desperate resolve. He couldn't build dreadnoughts to compete with the American fleet, but he could build a palace. And this palace was to become his main diplomatic weapon. It had to scream to the world that was creeping ever closer to his shores. We are a civilization, not a territory to be seized. We are a sovereign nation, equal to you. For this statement, a unique architectural language was chosen. Not Hawaiian, not European. Something in between, a strategic hybrid called American Florentine. It was a brilliant move. He was speaking to the West in its own imperial dialect. The majestic Corinthian columns are a direct quote from the vocabulary of power, stretching from ancient Rome to the White House in Washington. They declared, "We understand your symbols. We play by your rules." But this imperial language had a distinct Hawaiian accent. The palace is surrounded on all sides by wide, shady verandas, lanai. This is the soul of Hawaiian architecture, an element born of the tropical climate and the culture of hospitality. They seem to embrace the rigid European geometry, making it their own. And most importantly, the heart of the palace, its interiors. They were crafted from the precious, sacred woods of koa, kamani, and ku. While the facade conducted a dialogue with the world, the building's soul spoke to its own people. The monumental central staircase, carved from a single mass of koa wood, was not just a structure. It was an artery through which national pride flowed. This was his political argument, etched in stone and wood. Every detail was calculated. Every line was a statement. He had designed his manifesto of independence. But he didn't yet know that for every line of that manifesto, he would have to fight a war not against foreign powers, but within his own parliament. Every great dream begins not with the first stone, but with the first figure on a budget sheet. And at that moment, The romance of architecture collides with the harsh prose of accounting. For Iolani Palace, this battle became a war, fought not on the construction site, but in the pages of newspapers and in the halls of Parliament. In 1880, the Hawaiian legislature allocated an initial sum for the project, $50,000. On paper, it looked like a reasonable, controlled investment in national prestige. But this was just the first drop in an ocean of future expenses. Almost immediately, the attack began. It wasn't led by a foreign government, but by the American business community on the islands themselves. Their weapon was the printing press. The newspaper, Daily Pacific Commercial Advertiser, the mouthpiece of the sugar barons, unleashed a barrage of criticism on the project. They didn't see it as a symbol of sovereignty. They saw it as a flagrant waste. Why spend money on gilding and columns, they questioned, when their plantations needed new roads, bridges, and ports? It was they who coined the venomous phrase that stuck to the palace for decades: the royal folly. As soon as the foundation was laid, it became clear that $50,000 would not be enough. That sum vanished like water into volcanic sand. And so, King Kalākaua and his loyal prime minister, the charismatic adventurer Walter Murray Gibson, went to the Parliament for more money. Every new bill, every funding request, became a battlefield. In the Assembly Hall, they shouted about responsibility, made accusations of corruption, and demanded a stop to the madness. Gibson, a master of political theater, parried the blows, appealing to patriotism and national pride. But with each new tranche, the monarchy's authority melted away. The palace, not yet built, had already begun to devour not only money, but the political capital of its creator. The budget swelled at a catastrophic rate: 100,000, 200, 300. The final figure was astronomical, more than $340,000, a quarter of the entire kingdom's annual budget. That money could have built a fleet or dozens of schools. But the king was building his dream. Every carved element of koa wood, every porcelain vase, every chandelier delivered from Europe, was paid for not just with treasury funds. It was paid for with political compromises, eroded trust, and the growing hatred of those who saw the king not as a leader of the nation, but as a spendthrift leading the country to bankruptcy. But this public battle over the budget was just the tip of the iceberg. It was loud, humiliating, but at least it was out in the open. Far more dangerous was another financial game, played in silence, behind closed doors. The king was building a symbol of his independence with public money, but his personal freedom was already mortgaged, and that mortgage had a name. Behind the noise of the public budget debates, behind the furious newspaper articles, a different, far more dangerous game was being played. It was played not in Parliament, but in private offices, not with treasury dollars, but with the king's personal promissory notes. While Kalākaua was building the symbol of his power, he was quietly losing it in the shadow of a man named Klaus Spreckels. Spreckels was not Hawaiian. He was a Californian industrialist, the sugar king of America. A predator who saw the world as a collection of assets, and Hawaii as the most delectable of them all. He wasn't just a banker. He was a shadow ruler, a masterful puppeteer who understood that it was easier to buy a king than to conquer a kingdom. Kalākaua, with his love for balls, travel, and grandiose projects, was desperate for money. The state treasury was a battlefield, but his personal accounts were open for offers, and Spreckels made offers that couldn't be refused. He loaned the king enormous sums, becoming his friend and secret advisor. Every check Spreckels signed was not an act of generosity, but a purchase. He wasn't just buying land. he was buying control. In exchange for the loans, he received the unthinkable: control over half the sugar plantations on the island of Maui, exclusive rights to water, the lifeblood of the sugar industry. In effect, he became the owner of a whole chunk of the Hawaiian economy. Every dollar he lent the king returned to him 100-fold from the Hawaiian land itself. This is the greatest and most brutal irony in the history of Iolani. While its walls rose, proclaiming independence, its foundation sank deeper into a pit of debt dug by foreign capital. Every gilded cornice was paid for with a concession. Every crystal chandelier cast a shadow on the map of Hawaii, where more and more land was falling under Spreckles' control. The king was becoming a prisoner in a palace that wasn't even finished yet. He saw the world as an arena where the strongest survives, and his home was a monument to this philosophy. But while he was building his fortress to protect himself from the outside world, he failed to notice that the main enemy was already sitting at the same table with him, pouring his wine and becoming the owner of his kingdom. The palace that was meant to be his shield was, in fact, being forged with his enemy's money. He was building the most beautiful memorial in the world, a memorial to his own enslavement. When we look at the immaculate walls of Iolani, we see royal majesty. We admire the symmetry, the elegance, the precision of its execution. But the stone doesn't tell the whole story. It hides the price. Not the financial price, but the human one. It hides the sweat, the calluses, and the quiet murmurings of those whose hands carved this dream from the earth. The focus of the story shifts from the king and his ambitions to the people on the construction site. Every great construction is a story not just of architects, but of the nameless hands that hauled, chiseled, and lifted the stones. And in the case of Iolani Palace, many of those hands had no choice. While the battle for the budget raged in Parliament, the king and his builders faced a harsh reality. There wasn't enough money, and there were few skilled laborers on the islands. And so, a decision was made that would forever cast a shadow on the palace's shining facade. The labor of prisoners from Oahu prison was used for the construction. This wasn't just a way to save money. It was a moral dilemma, stitched into the very foundation of the project. A symbol of national freedom, built by the hands of unfree men. A monument to progress, erected with methods that seemed like a relic of the past. Imagine the labor. Under the scorching Hawaiian sun, in clouds of dust, the prisoners performed the heaviest work. They quarried stone, mixed concrete, hauled scaffolding. The majestic columns, which today seem to us the embodiment of grace, were raised to the sky by their efforts. They were hauled, they were chiseled, they were set in place by men who returned to prison cells every night. We don't know their names, we don't know their crimes, but we can imagine their stories. Were there any among them who believed they were building the future of the nation? Or was every strike of the hammer just a reminder of their own chains? What did they feel, watching a building rise that they were never destined to enter as free citizens? The palace, which was meant to be the heart of the nation, had a dark, ambiguous foundation from the very beginning. Its walls were cemented not only with mortar, but with silent protest, unspoken resentment, and human fatigue. Every perfectly fitted detail conceals a story of coercion. King Kalākaua was building a monument to his philosophy, but this monument demanded sacrifices not only from the treasury, it demanded them from the people. But even the sweat and stone of local convicts could not solve the main problem, a problem that could not be bypassed or resolved through brute force. Its name was the Pacific Ocean. In our time, the Pacific Ocean is not a barrier, but a bridge. A container ship crosses it in a few days, a plane in a few hours. But in the 1880s, the ocean was not a bridge. It was a monster. A vast, indifferent void that separated Hawaii from the rest of the world. And every demand of the new palace became a battle with this monster. The problem was embedded in the very DNA of the project. Iolani Palace was a European fantasy born in Polynesia. And this fantasy was hungry. It demanded materials that simply did not exist on the islands. Hawaii could provide the stone for the foundation and the precious koa wood for the interiors. But the palace demanded more. It demanded thousands of cubic meters of cement, huge sheets of polished glass from San Francisco, roof tiles from Pennsylvania, decorative tiles from England. Every nail, every screw, every doorknob had to cross thousands of miles of hostile water. Every voyage was a gamble. A ship could be caught in a storm. The cargo could be damaged. Deadlines were missed. The budget was stretched to its breaking point. And then, disaster struck. The main supplier of bricks on the islands went bankrupt. The construction, already slow, ground to a halt. The majestic frame of the palace stood bare and empty, waiting for what the island could no longer give it. A replacement had to be found urgently. New materials, concrete blocks imitating stone, had to be ordered and brought from afar. Every day of downtime cost money and reputation. Imagine the drama of the delivery. A ship enters Honolulu harbor. On its board, priceless, fragile treasures. Giant mirrors for the ballroom, each worth a fortune. Dozens of crystal chandeliers, packed in straw and prayers. Any wrong turn of the crane, any jolt during unloading, and the king's dream would shatter into 1,000 pieces on the pier. But the ocean brought not only materials, it brought people, expertise that was absent in Hawaii, master cabinet makers, plumbing specialists, electrical engineers. Each one had to be persuaded, paid a fortune, and brought to the edge of the world to breathe life into the king's ambitious project. It was a race against time, against distance, against nature itself. The palace slowly, painfully took shape, consuming resources and testing the nerves of its creators. The walls were raised, the roof was in place, the stone skeleton was ready. But this was not enough for King Kalākaua. He didn't just want to build a house. He wanted to place a miracle inside it. He wanted to steal fire from the gods and light it in the very heart of the Pacific Ocean. And this task was even more impossible. In the 19th century, the world lived by the light of the flame. Gas lights hissed on the streets of London. Kerosene lamps cast trembling shadows in the living rooms of Boston. The night was a force, an element that could only be temporarily and timidly pushed back. But for King Kalākaua, this was not enough. He didn't just want to light his home. He wanted to abolish the night. During his trip around the world, he met a man who promised this miracle. His name was Thomas Edison. In his laboratory, the Hawaiian monarch didn't just see a light bulb. He saw the future. And he wanted that future for his kingdom. Immediately. His new obsession bordered on madness. He gave his engineers an impossible task. Iolani Palace had to get electric lighting before the White House in Washington, before Buckingham Palace in London. It was the most audacious technological challenge that could be thrown down from an island lost in the ocean. This wasn't about buying technology, but creating it from scratch in the most unfavorable conditions on the planet. They had to build Hawaii's first hydroelectric power station, tame a river, and force it to turn turbines. They had to run miles of copper wire through valleys and hills to the very heart of Honolulu. Every meter of this wire was an artery through which the new, electric blood of civilization was to flow. And so, In 1886, the great moment arrived. The palace stood dark, like a sleeping giant. A crowd gathered on its lawns. They watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. And then, the king himself emerged from the darkness. He did not entrust this miracle to his engineers. This was his triumph. He approached a crude wooden panel with a copper switch. It was the altar of a new faith. He took hold of the handle. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, with an effort, he threw the switch. Nothing. A second stretched into an eternity. A whisper of disappointment rippled through the crowd. And suddenly, a faint hum. One light bulb above the entrance flickered, then another. And then, as if on command, the palace erupted in light. 325 light bulbs flared to life at once. The building awoke. Its windows became hundreds of white eyes, staring into the astonished tropical night. The light was so bright, so unnatural, that it flooded not only the palace, but the surrounding streets, banishing shadows from under every tree. For the first time in Polynesian history, man had created his own day in the middle of the night. In that moment, it seemed that anything was possible, that the king's dream of a modern, enlightened, independent Hawaii had come true. It was his greatest victory. He had brought light to his people. But he didn't know that a bright light doesn't just drive away the darkness, it also attracts predators. Light had defeated darkness. Western technology had conquered the tropical night. But the battle for the palace's soul was just beginning, and it was no longer being fought on the outside, but within. It was a cultural war, quiet but desperate, that unfolded in every hall, every room, in every detail of the interior. If the palace's facade, with its Corinthian columns, was a statement to the outside world, its interior was meant to speak to the Hawaiian land itself. It was to become the heart of a nation, beating inside a foreign stone shell. And the blood of this heart was wood. Not just any wood, but sacred, rare species that had been part of Hawaiian culture for centuries. Koa, kamani, ku. These were not just building materials. They were carriers of history, spirits of the forest embodied in wood. At the center of this battle for identity were the master cabinet makers. They didn't just follow blueprints. They engaged in a dialogue with the material. Their chisels revealed not only the patterns of the wood, but the very essence of the islands. Long, smooth panels, polished to a mirror shine, told of the ocean's calm. Intricate, ornate patterns on the doorways were reminiscent of the tangled roots of ancient banyan trees. And in the very center of the palace, in its main hall, rose the ultimate symbol of this cultural resistance. A monumental staircase, carved from a solid mass of koa wood. Koa is not just timber. For Hawaiians, it is a symbol of strength, resilience, and royal dignity. It was used to make canoes capable of crossing oceans and weapons for great warriors. This staircase was not just a way to get from the first floor to the second. It was the spine of the palace, its spiritual core. To climb these steps was to take a journey into the very heart of Hawaiian pride. Every step echoed with a deep, noble sound. The railings, adorned with the coat of arms of the Kingdom of Hawaii, were not just a support for the hand. They were the physical embodiment of Kalākaua's own motto, Ho'ulu Lahui, increase the nation. This was his strategy, to increase the nation not just in number, but in spirit. He dressed the Hawaiian soul in a European suit. He hid a Polynesian heart within a ribcage built to Western specifications. He believed that in this way, he could preserve one without frightening away the other. The palace was almost ready. Its stone body spoke to Europe. Its electric veins pulsed with the technology of America, and its wooden heart beat to the rhythm of ancient Hawaii. All that remained was to breathe life into it, to throw a celebration that would make the whole world believe that his incredible, risky gambit had succeeded. 1886. The palace is complete. It stands, shining with electric lights, like a jewel cast into the velvet of a tropical night. Now, it was to fulfill its main function, to become a stage on which Hawaii would prove to the world its right to exist. The occasion was King Kalākaua's 50th birthday, but this was no mere birthday party. It was 2 weeks of carefully orchestrated political theater, designed to dazzle, to charm, and to convince. The festivities began with a grand ball. Into the throne room, under the glitter of crystal chandeliers, flocked foreign diplomats, naval officers, and world dignitaries. They saw not just a palace. They saw a statement. They waltzed in the very heart of Polynesia, in a hall that rivaled those of Europe. The music for this waltz was played by the Royal Hawaiian Band. Their melodies, a blend of European marches and Hawaiian motifs, were the soundtrack to Kalākaua's dream of a harmonious fusion of two worlds. The palace lived. It breathed. It welcomed guests. It was fulfilling its mission. But the most powerful act of this theater took place not in the ballroom, but on the lawn in front of the palace. For the first time in decades, for the first time since missionaries had branded it as sinful paganism, the ancient hula was performed in public. It was an act of cultural defiance. Under the gaze of foreign diplomats, Hawaiian culture, so long suppressed, declared its revival. The dancers' movements told the stories of gods and chiefs. Their chants were the voice of the land itself. Kalākaua didn't just permit this dance. He proclaimed it the soul of his nation. For those 2 weeks, it seemed the king had won, that his risky gamble had paid off. The palace was working. It was crafting an image of a strong, modern, culturally rich, and independent nation. Foreign consuls sent enthusiastic dispatches to their capitals. Newspapers wrote of the Pearl of the Pacific. A smile never left the face of the merry monarch. But this was a waltz on a volcano. Beneath the gilded splendor and the rustle of ball gowns, hatred was already brewing. The very sugar barons on whose money this celebration was built watched not with admiration, but with cold calculation. They saw not the revival of a nation, but a threat to their influence. They heard not music, but the drums of Hawaiian nationalism. They counted every dollar spent on this pagan carnival and added it to their blacklist of grievances. The party was in full swing. The band played on. Champagne flowed like a river. But outside the palace gates, in the quiet of their offices, the king's enemies were already sharpening their bayonets. It was the last, most beautiful dance before the catastrophe. Paradise ended in 1887, exactly 1 year after the triumphant Jubilee. The music fell silent, the festive lights went out, and a harsh reality set in. On the morning of June 30th, Honolulu awoke a different city. Armed men marched in the streets. This was not a foreign army. They were their own. Members of the so-called Hawaiian League, a secret society of American and European businessmen. Their armed wing, the Honolulu Rifles Militia, composed of white planters, merchants, and their sons, seized control of the city. They didn't storm the palace. That would have been too crude. They employed a more sophisticated, more humiliating tactic. They surrounded it. They occupied key government buildings. They cut the king off from his guard, from his people, from power itself. Iolani Palace, built as a demonstration of strength, had become a besieged fortress overnight. And then a delegation entered the palace, not petitioners, not ambassadors, conquerors. In his own study, surrounded by furniture he had personally chosen, under the gaze of his ancestors' portraits, King Kalākaua faced an ultimatum. A document was placed on his desk, a new constitution. It was not a proposal, it was a sentence. While the Honolulu rifles rattled their weapons outside his study window, the king read the lines that destroyed everything he had lived for. This document, which would go down in history as the Bayonet Constitution, was an act of political castration. It stripped the monarch of his veto power. It transferred all executive power to a cabinet of ministers, who could now be dismissed only by the legislature, not the king. But most importantly, it changed the voting rules. It imposed high property and literacy requirements, which instantly disenfranchised 2/3 of native Hawaiians. At the same time, it granted this right to wealthy foreigners, even if they were not citizens of the kingdom. It was a legal coup disguised as reform. Kalākaua looked into the faces of the men who had smiled at him at balls just yesterday. He saw a cold, ruthless determination. He knew his guard could not stand against the militia. Any resistance would mean bloodshed, and he surrendered. With his own hand, in his own palace, he signed the document that turned him from a ruler into a puppet. In that moment, Iolani Palace suffered its first, most crushing defeat. It was built as a shield, but when the enemy came, the shield was powerless. It could not protect the kingdom, nor its creator. It became a silent witness to his greatest humiliation. The symbol of power became a monument to powerlessness. Humiliation breeds anger, and anger, if strong enough, turns into a desperate hope for revenge. For 2 years, Hawaii lived under the oppression of the Bayonet Constitution. The king was a mere shadow. Power belonged to the cabinet, which acted in the interests of the sugar barons. But among the people, resistance was growing. On July 30th, 1889, that hope spilled onto the streets. It was led by a young Hawaiian patriot named Robert Wilcox. He had received a military education in Italy at the kingdom's expense and returned home to find his monarch humiliated. He could not accept it. Gathering about 150 supporters, veterans of the Royal Guard and ordinary citizens, Wilcox led them not to the legislature, not to the conspirators' homes. He led them to the palace. His plan was both bold and symbolic. He wanted to occupy Iolani Palace, the symbol of the nation, and from there, force King Kalākaua to repeal the shameful constitution. He believed the people and the rest of the army would join him. In the early morning, the rebels occupied the palace grounds and neighboring government buildings without a single shot fired. They dug in right on the immaculate manicured lawns that had so recently been the stage for royal balls. Barricades took the place of waltzes. Instead of the band's music, a tense anticipation hung in the air. But the king hesitated. He hid in his private bungalow, unwilling to either lead the rebellion or order his troops to attack. This indecision proved fatal. Government forces, loyal to the cabinet of ministers, quickly recovered. They surrounded the palace. A firefight began. Bullets whistled over the flower beds, chipping pieces from the Corinthian columns, shattering windows. The palace, which had first been a residence and then a site of humiliation, had now turned into a true battlefield. The battle was short and brutal. The rebels, poorly armed and without a leader, could not hold out for long against the organized forces. By evening, it was all over. The Wilcox rebellion had failed. 7 of his supporters were killed. Their blood was spilled on the very ground where the hula was once danced to celebrate the nation's rebirth. The The consequences were horrific. The palace was now more than just a symbol of powerlessness. It had become a place where Hawaiians killed Hawaiians, a place of patriots' bloodshed. It was desecrated from within, and although King Kalākaua was not involved in the rebellion, it utterly destroyed his authority. He had built his fortress, but he failed to consider that the greatest threat would come not from without, but from within, and that one day this fortress would demand a blood sacrifice. King David Kalākaua died in 1891, not in his magnificent palace, but far from home in San Francisco, broken, ill, and stripped of any real power. The crown passed to his sister, Liliʻuokalani, Queen Liliʻuokalani. For her, Iolani Palace was not just an inheritance, it was a gilded cage. From the outside, it still looked like a symbol of the monarchy. Inside, it was the epicenter of a conspiracy. Every minister, every courtier, every servant could be a spy. Every document she signed passed through the hands of people who hated her. She tried to rule. Intelligent, resolute, with a strong sense of national duty. She was the complete opposite of her brother. She didn't want balls and parties. She wanted to restore the dignity and rights of her people, stolen by the Bayonet Constitution. But her every move was met with fierce resistance. And yet, life in the palace went on as if nothing had changed. It was a masquerade where everyone played their part. The palace was still the center of social life. Famous guests were received here. The Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson, a close friend of the royal family, was a frequent visitor to the Blue Room, holding long conversations with the Queen. He saw, behind her royal dignity, a deep sadness and a premonition of disaster. Receptions were still held in the throne room. Foreign consuls bowed to her, knowing her power was a fiction. Local businessmen shook her hand while scheming behind her back to destroy the monarchy completely. Every waltz played in that hall sounded like a funeral dirge. Every smile was a mask. Liliʻuokalani knew she was surrounded by enemies. She knew the palace was bugged and her mail was being read. But she continued to fight. She began secretly working on a new constitution that would restore power to the monarch and voting rights to native Hawaiians. It was her last, desperate move. She underestimated her enemies. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for a pretext, waiting for the moment to strike the final, fatal blow. And she herself, in her quest for justice, gave them that pretext. The air in the palace was not fragrant with tropical flowers. It was thick with the electric tension of an impending coup d'etat. January 17th, 1893. The day the masquerade ended. The pretext for the Queen's enemies was her attempt to proclaim a new constitution. The so-called Committee of Safety, consisting of 13 American planters and lawyers, declared this an act of revolution and called for the overthrow of the monarchy. But this time, they weren't acting alone. At their request, 162 armed Marines disembarked from the American war cruiser, Boston, anchored in Honolulu Harbor. Officially, it was to protect American lives and property. In reality, it was to exert military pressure. They didn't storm the palace. They simply marched past it and took up positions, their very presence demonstrating whose side they were on. Iolani Palace, the heart of the kingdom, was caught in a vice. On one side, the local militia of the conspirators. On the other, the regular troops of the United States. Queen Liliʻuokalani stood no chance. To avoid bloodshed, she surrendered. But she did not surrender to the rebellious Committee of Safety. In her final official statement, she wisely and far-sightedly wrote that she was yielding her authority to the superior force of the United States of America, until such time as the U.S. government could investigate the actions of its representatives and restore her to her lawful throne. But that never happened. The palace became the epicenter of her personal tragedy. 2 years later, after a failed attempt by her supporters to stage an uprising, the Queen was arrested on charges of treason. And then began the most humiliating act of this drama. She was put on trial, but not in a courthouse, in her own home, in the throne room of Iolani Palace, there, where she had received ambassadors, where she had been crowned, where the portraits of her ancestors hung. The conspirators set up a military tribunal. It was a farce, a spectacle designed to break her spirit. She was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. The sentence was commuted to house arrest. But the place of her confinement was not some other house. It was her own palace. She was locked in a small bedroom on the 2nd floor. Guards stood at her door around the clock. The windows were painted over. She was forbidden from receiving visitors and reading newspapers. The palace, which had been her home, her battlefield, her last hope, now became her prison. But it was here, in this gilded cell, locked away for 8 long months, that Queen Liliʻuokalani showed incredible strength of spirit. Stripped of her power, she found her weapon in creativity. She composed music that became an anthem of sorrow and hope for her people. It was here she wrote the famous song, Aloha O, Farewell to Thee. It was a farewell not to a loved one, but to an entire kingdom. And she sewed. Day after day, stitch by stitch, she created her famous quilt. Into its patchwork patterns, she wove not just threads, but coded messages, dates of key events, scenes from her life and the history of Hawaii. This quilt became her silent manifesto, an act of unbreakable resistance. Her enemies could lock up her body, but they could not lock up her memory and her spirit. The palace became her prison, but she turned her prison into a sanctuary. The most bitter irony in the history of Iolani Palace is not its fall, it is its survival. The conspirators did not dare to demolish it. Instead, they did something worse. They desecrated it. They moved in. The palace, a symbol of Hawaiian sovereignty, became the capital. First, of the provisional government, then of the self-proclaimed Republic of Hawaii, then of the territory, and finally, of the state of the United States. The conquerors moved into the home of the conquered. This occupation was brutal and tasteless. The majestic throne room, where kings had received ambassadors, was crudely converted into the House of Representatives. The royal bedroom, where Liliʻuokalani spent 8 months in confinement, housed the governor's office. The Blue Room became the Senate chamber. The priceless, unique furniture that Kalākaua had personally commissioned from all over the world was simply put up for public auction. Thrones, tables of koa wood, Chinese vases, French clocks, everything was sold off for pennies. The palace's soul was sold under the hammer. The years went by. In the magnificent halls, ugly plywood partitions were erected to squeeze in more bureaucrats. Electrical wires were nailed with rusty nails directly onto the carved wooden panels. The tropical humidity and termites slowly devoured the building from within. By the 1960s, the palace was a mere shadow of its former self. It was old, sick, and humiliated. But then, a miracle began. When the state government finally built a new, modern capital next door and moved out of the palace in 1969, the great battle for its salvation began. For decades, millimeter by millimeter, restorers, historians, and volunteers brought the palace's soul back. They scraped away layers of government-issue paint to find the original, royal colors. They search the world for the lost furniture, buying it back at auctions and from the descendants of those who had once bought it for a pittance. They restored every carved pattern, every detail, using old photographs and inventory lists. And today, Iolani Palace is not just a museum. It is living proof of what was lost. In 1993, on the 100th anniversary of the coup, it was here, before its gates, that the United States Congress officially apologized to the Hawaiian people for its complicity in the illegal overthrow of their government. Today, it is the only place on U.S. soil where the flag of the Kingdom of Hawaii flies. The royal furniture once again stands in its halls, and in one of the display cases lies the quilt stitched by the captive queen. Every stitch is a reminder of an unbreakable spirit. The palace survived. It outlasted its creators and its conquerors. It was a symbol of power, then a battlefield, a prison, and an office. And today, it has become a symbol of memory. It stands in the center of a modern American city to tell the story of what was stolen and to hold an eternal, unquenchable hope for what might yet be restored. Our journey to the heart of Iolani Palace comes to an end. But we are not just leaving a museum, we are leaving a battlefield where architecture became a weapon, and the light of electric lamps was a desperate attempt to drive away the encroaching darkness. We saw how a symbol of pride became a symbol of humiliation, how a king's home became his prison, how a bastion of independence turned into the headquarters of those who stole that independence. And in this lies the main lesson of Iolani. A building's greatness is not defined by its budget or the intentions of its creator. Its true value is determined by the spirit of those who refuse to forget it. Kalākaua's palace is proof that you can capture a throne room, but you cannot capture the soul of a nation as long as even one person lives who remembers who that throne truly belonged to. In the end, what is more valuable? A palace, shining with the lights of progress, or the land on which it stands? And can a building born of debt and compromise become a true symbol of freedom? The story of Iolani Palace is not over. It is being written right now, in debates, in books, and in the comments under this film. What does this story mean to you? Share your thoughts. If this investigation made you think, please support our work. Your subscription and your feedback are the light that keeps stories like this from sinking into darkness.